So this sounds like a really exciting trip. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
So basically, I'm going to be flying down to New Orleans, and my goal is to collect a whole bunch of oral history interviews from elderly African-American credit union people. So people who were active in the movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And there's a bunch of stuff I feel like I want to learn, because I've been doing a lot of research on the history of the credit union movement. But there's this huge gap in that, most of that history is based on these kind of written records that have survived. Mm-hmm. And those written records tend to be kind of, produced by people who had high status in the movement. They were, the editor of, say, the Credit Union Bridge, which was the publication of CUNA. Or they were, the head of the State League, or, and they were putting their newsletter out.
Right.
So the vast majority of material that's available kind of comes from those sources. And what that has kind of meant is that the story of the credit union movement has tended to be the story of those sort of high status people who tended to be more white, more male, really sort of reflecting the power dynamics of their time. And so my hope is that by interviewing a good cross-section of African American credit union people, mostly from across the South, although I've got at least one interview lined up in New York City as well.
Cool.
To sort of provide this new body of sources that people who are interested in the history of credit unions can consult when looking at, okay, well, what was the African American experience? And there's a lot of questions that really, I've been hard-pressed to find answers to. Like, for instance, especially in the South, how did the culture and sort of institution of segregation play out in the credit union movement? Mm-hmm. Really, the only reference I've found is in a history of the Virginia Credit Union League, which talks about in the 50s, sort of there having been this tension around the league. There were, majority black credit unions, and the league sort of having all members participate in the sort of annual meeting, but having segregated or just whites only sort of social events, and all the event like the sort of dinner, banquet, and that sort of thing was whites only, even though the African Americans could participate in the actual governance meeting. But that's really the only reference I've been able to find to, and it was sort of, that was in reference to 1959 being the first year that sort of segregation stopped happening. But I want to sort of hear from other folks about from their perspective, how did that play out? Was the credit union movement ahead of the curve? Were different places, did it play out differently? And how did change happen? And also sort of kind of related to that, the connection to the civil rights movement. Because when I found out that, when I really sort of dug into the sort of Martin Luther King support for credit unions and the attempts by the Montgomery Improvement Association to form a credit union in 1957 and again in 1959, and having their application rejected both times, sort of looking at, okay, well, this definitely inspired other folks in the civil rights movement to embrace credit unionism. And you had this growth in the 70s and 80s of credit unions organized through black churches, which were sort of one of the foundational institutions of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Really, how things got organized was through the churches. So I want to kind of look at that. And then there's also sort of something that Jeff Hardin cued me in on in North Carolina, which is as the regulatory system got more intense, especially after the establishment of the National Credit Union Administration and share insurance. Mm-hmm. One of the big trends was that I think that I've come to the conclusion that share insurance was one of the largest drivers of the consolidation of the credit union movement. And the NCUA tended to sort of treat sort of marginal credit unions, or what it perceived to be marginal credit unions, as something to sort of be gotten rid of and just be merged into larger institutions. And according to Jeff Hardin, and I'm hoping to interview one of these fellows in North Carolina, there's a guy who just sort of went back and forth across the state filing lawsuits against the NCUA to protect black credit unions from just being swallowed up. And I think it's something that you can kind of see in the regulatory system, where you have this incentive of regulators to regulate a few large institutions rather than many small institutions. And because the large institutions tend to both, you have less work, but also the people who run it tend to be more professional, more sort of peers of the regulators, rather than having the regulator sort of be supporting people who are amateur, semi-professional, running much smaller institutions.
Yeah.
And then you could have that extra layer of, you add a little bit of subtle racism to the mix, and sort of, you could easily see the regulatory structure in the NCUA in the 70s and 80s as being a real sort of oppressive force, kind of retarding the development of the African American credit union movement. So I want to sort of investigate that. There's a lot of things that I think could be the case, but there's really little written on it. So I'm hoping from these stories that I'll collect that it'll shed a lot of light on the African American experience, and also just like, how did people learn about credit unions? What were their motivations to get them started? Like what impacts did they have? Like what was the material impact on their communities?
That's really cool. There's a lot to dig into there. I imagine you'll be sort of encountering a lot of volunteers who put a lot of effort into this, into building the credit union movement, through like really grassroots and organizing and energy, and potentially there's a lot of texture there to provide to that story of credit unions in the South. So that should be really cool.
Yeah, and I'm still in the process of finalizing my list of interviewees, and we'll probably be continuing to develop it as I'm on the road, on the fly. But I just got off the phone with the sort of head of the history committee of the African American Credit Union Coalition, and she was telling me about this one fellow in Mississippi who I'm really excited to meet, who's 91 years old and is still involved in his credit union, still as a volunteer, and in the entire 50 plus years that he's been involved, it has been as a volunteer. So just to be able to sit down and hear his story, and ask him these questions and get his insight and wisdom about what's the meaning of the credit union movement, how has it changed, what drives someone to sort of be in that role for decade after decade, and sort of see this as their service to the world, more or less.
Right.
And so, I think the stories will be really interesting, and I'm gonna, just bring my little video camera, set it on the table, and go for probably I'm gonna aim for 1 to 2 hour interviews with folks, long enough to really sort of develop a rapport and kind of get into the nitty gritty and ask the serious questions, but not so long that folks get exhausted and burned out either. And my goal will be to really sort of have a quick turnaround time on at least the fairly raw on it, limit with very little editing. So basically shoot the video, do some light editing, make sure the audio is good, all that, and then upload it within a day or two, and throw up a blog post on credit union history.
That's awesome. So we'll be able to follow your progress from the road. Cool.
Yep.
Cool.
I was actually even just thinking of I'll probably use the Cooperative Vermont YouTube channel and just pop things up as I go.
Yeah.
So if folks out there are subscribed to it, just go on YouTube, look for Cooperative Vermont. You can find all our old episodes, and you'll be able to soon find, hopefully, a bunch of oral history interviews.
That's cool. That's really cool. What's the logistics of your trip going to look like? What areas are you planning on hitting?
So I'm flying into New Orleans, and then spending a few days there, sort of for vacation, because it's my partner's her February break set from teaching school. So nice. We'll have a few days of just enjoying the city, because neither of us have ever been there before, and then it'll be probably we'll rent a car. She'll fly back to Vermont, and then I'll rent a car, and then kind of go spend a couple more days in Louisiana, and then go from Louisiana to Mississippi. Probably a day in Mississippi, and then the folks at the Alabama League have been especially amazingly helpful, and so I've got a bunch of leads there. So I could probably spend maybe 2 days in Alabama, and then I'll roll up to probably spend 2 days in Georgia, then turn in my rental car, take a bus up to Chattanooga, where I've got a friend whose place I can stay at. Plus I've got some leads on some interviews there. And then North Carolina, where Jeff Harden with the Carolinas League has been very interested in the topic of African American history for a while. So he's done some groundwork already. So he's
Cool.
a great source of sources.
Yeah.
Then up through Virginia. There's one credit union I'm particularly interested. There's probably a few interviews that are going to come out of this, but they're an African American credit union that's a Catholic parish credit union, because in the segregation era, there was for Black Catholics in D.C. Church was established in Arlington, Virginia, and so the credit union is the sort of credit union for that Black Catholic church. And they're I think about to hit their 50th anniversary of the establishment of the credit union. So their treasurer was pretty excited to, get in touch that this project was happening. So he's reached out and I think has had some communications with some of the founders. So I think I should get a number of interviews on that one.
Cool.
And then sort of be around there. I've got some family in that area, so I'll also spend a little time visiting them. And then the last stop before I come back to Vermont will be New York City, where there's an 81 or 82-year-old man who was referred to me, whose father was the founder who's been very involved in credit unions, but his father was the founder of the first Black credit union in New York, and who was actually an associate of Marcus Garvey, who was an early, African-American leader, kind of very much sort of a forerunner of the kind of Black nationalist school of thought in many ways. He supported a lot of kind of like Pan-Africanism, sort of developing a connection between the Black community in the United States and sort of in Africa.
Right.
And was also very into the sort of whole kind of building African-American economic development, sort of the economic development of like African-American communities. So I think that it'll be interesting to sort of talk to him a little bit about the connection between that and the formation of this kind of, I think it was progressive credit union in New York. And then I'll hop on a train or bus and be back in Burlington, hopefully in time for our next show.
Awesome. Be really interested to see, how. I imagine that a lot of these credit unions have really strong ties to their, founding members, and how that plays out to date.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also one of those things where, like, I think you can see in the African American credit union movement a little bit more of because it was connected to the civil rights movement, that it still has a lot more of that kind of populist mode of credit unionism that has been, I think, kind of absorbed and sort of quieted in a lot of the rest of the credit union movement as the merger movement has happened, and
right.
We've had bigger, more professionalized credit unions. I think that that there's really sort of these unique institutions that there's more of them than that reflect a different way of doing credit unionism, and I think there's a lot to learn from that.
And the different cultures of their membership too. I mean, the diversity that sort of you lose through mergers is there's a downside there.
Yeah, the identity that's really lost,
right,
I think, is one of the big things.
Yeah.
Is that you kind of go from having kind of an economic institution that's seen as the economic arm of a community. The way that the community members can help each other. Using the credit union is one way of doing that. To saying, okay, you have something that's cooperative, but the relationship is individual between the individual member and the credit union, not between, the members of the community.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I think that that'll be one of those topics definitely want to touch on too. But so it'll be a lot of I've done raised a little bit of money via a crowdfunding site that should hopefully cover the lion's share of the transportation costs.
Nice.
And but there'll be kind of a lot of trying to couch surf and find as the cheapest motels possible where I can't do that. And
yeah, I mean it's a huge endeavor, and it's amazing you're doing it. Really,
I'm pretty excited. It's like the sort of thing where I was like, all right, I've been doing my previous job for about 2 years, and I was ready to sort of make a leap back into this, and I was like, all right, this feels like the right project to do. So I'm very excited, and I think there'll be some good stories coming out of it.